Hello, my name is Boris Sidoruk, Chair of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress National Internment Committee. I'm here to introduce the topic and the people that have brought us here today. More than 80,000 Ukrainians were branded enemy aliens during Canada's first national internment operations of 1914 to 1920. In addition, almost 5,000 Ukrainians, including men, women, and children, were interned as forced laborers in 24 Canadian concentration camps during the First World War and afterwards. More than 8,000 people were interned in total. People were interned not because of anything they had done, but only because of where they had come from, who they were. There was no evidence then, nor has there been found since, of divided loyalties on part of the victims of these internment measures. In the late 1990s, representatives from the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Association, myself and Mikhailo Ilnitsky, met with the Honourable Jason Kenney, then Member of the Parliament for Calgary Southeast, introducing him to Canada's first national internment operations of 1914 to 1920. Prime Minister Stephen Harper appointed the Honourable Jason Kenney as Secretary of State for Multiculturalism and Canadian Identity to negotiate with the representatives of the Ukrainian Canadian community an honourable settlement of claims arising from Canada's first national internment operations of 1914 to 1920. These representatives were Dr. Lubomir Lutsuk from the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Association, Dr. Pavlo Grod, President of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, and Mr. Andriy Klarashowski, President of the Taras Shevchenko Foundation. On May 8, 2008, an agreement to create a $10 million endowment fund was signed by the Honourable Jason Kenney and Mr. Klarashowski. The Canadian First World War Internment Recognition Fund was created to manage these funds. The purpose being to educate Canadians and commemorate this little-known episode of Canadian history. The Honourable Jason Kenney has agreed to share his thoughts and journey through his decades of involvement with Canada's first national internment operations. The Honourable Tyler Shandro, who served as a cabinet minister in the then Premier Jason Kenney's Alberta provincial government, will be asking Honourable Jason Kenney questions about his internment journey. At the end of his interview, representatives of some of Calgary's Ukrainian Canadian youth groups and dance ensembles will be asking the Honourable Kenney questions about his internment journey. I would like to thank the Echoes of Ukraine for recording the event. I would also like to acknowledge the Shevchenko Foundation, World War I Internment Legacy Fund for their financial support for this recording.
Привіт. Thank you so much for joining us here today for this conversation, Premier. I want to begin this conversation going back about 25 years ago. You had a meeting in your constituency office with the Ukrainian community, and the issue of internment operations was raised. I wanted to ask you an open-ended question about what memories you have from that conversation about the internment operations, because for me, growing up as a Ukrainian Canadian, third, fourth generation, depending on how you count it, I didn't know about internment operations until the 90s when I went to university.
Right.
When did you first learn about internment operations? Was it at that meeting, or did you know?
I think maybe at that meeting, Tyler, I'm a big history buff and know Canadian history and war history very well. And when Boris and his delegation from the local Ukrainian community presented this to me, I was, I think, astonished. I was surprised because it's something I had not read about before. And what they were doing at that meeting 25 years ago was part of a broader process of the Ukrainian Canadian community to begin to educate decision makers, opinion leaders about the First World War internment. I think a lot of Canadians I think vast majority of Canadians are aware of the Second World War internment of Japanese Canadians. Technically, they weren't actually interned, but they were forced to move away from the West Coast. Their property was expropriated, and Prime Minister Mulroney made a formal apology and redress to Canadians of Japanese origin for the injustice of that internment operation when he was Prime Minister, I think in 1988. And so that took a lot of profile, but the truth is this, that it wasn't until history professor at the Royal Military College in Kingston named Lubomir Luciuk started to read archives. He had heard some rumors in the community about this, and he started to go up to Ottawa and dive through the archives, and lo and behold, started to find evidence of this. I think what happened was that the internees after the war, and by the way, some of the camps stayed open all the way until I think 1920, but after the camps were closed and the internees returned back to their normal Canadian lives, they didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to pass on the memory of it to their kids. They felt they were ashamed. They felt that they had been somehow judged by the Canadian government as disloyal, and they didn't want to talk about that. It was a bitter, sad, sorrowful experience that they just internalized. They just kind of repressed and didn't demand recognition, didn't demand apologies or redress. Meanwhile, the Dominion government, the Canadian government, destroyed a lot of the records, knocked down the buildings in the camps, and the Canadian government had an interest in just kind of putting it to bed and moving on. So it really wasn't until Professor Luciuk did his research in the 1990s. I think he did a very important article, if I'm not mistaken, in the Canadian Historical Journal in the late 1990s on his initial evidence. That's what started to break it open, and then that's when the Ukrainian Canadian community said we need to have a serious public discussion about the issue, and that's how I got educated about it as an opposition MP 25 years ago.
And how did that conversation with the community change your perspective?
Well, it was astonishing to me to find this really kind of morbid part of Canadian history about which I knew nothing. And I will say that a few years later, I had the privilege of being appointed Secretary of State for Multiculturalism by Prime Minister Harper. One of the very first things I was working on was redress for the injustice of the Chinese Head Tax and Exclusion Act, which was a series of racist policies designed to effectively prevent people of Chinese ethnicity from migrating to Canada. And based on the model of Prime Minister Mulroney's redress for the Second World War Japanese dislocation and internment, I led some consultations with older Chinese Canadians, some of whom had actually paid the head tax, to figure out what we should do there. And we went through that whole process. And around that time, the Ukrainian Canadian community approached me and said, hey, we think it's time for a formal recognition of what happened. They actually didn't ask for an apology per se, but appropriate historical recognition and redress. And I'll have to be honest, we didn't really have a template for that sort of thing. The Mulroney apology and redress for the Japanese relocation policy of the Second War was really the first time the Canadian government ever done something like this. And I got to tell you, you're a former Attorney General and you're a lawyer. You know that government lawyers are very risk averse, and they go to work every day to protect the Crown, the government. And the government lawyers kept telling us, you don't want to acknowledge that anything wrong happened. You certainly don't want to apologize, because in so doing, you're opening us up, the government up, for all sorts of potential civil claims and financial liability. So the advice that governments had received for decades, and different partisan stripes, was just don't deal with this stuff. And I think there was also, Tyler, a view, which is totally understandable, the view held by Pierre Trudeau on these things, which is that, contrary to Scripture, the sins of the fathers should not be visited upon the sons. That is to say, that the sins, the wrongdoing of previous generations should not be, there's no culpability in successive generations for those historic injustices. So there was a resistance, but I had to work my way through that with the Ukrainian community.
Wow. Something you said there reminded me of a speech I heard you give, not on internment operations. I think it was about commemoration of Holodomor, but you have quoted Elie Wiesel's Nobel Prize winning acceptance speech and about the duty of remembrance, the duty of Zahor. Tell me, because that is important to you, the duty of remembrance, how that affected how you dealt with the situation.
Yes, as Elie Wiesel said in that speech, it is incumbent upon us to remember the evil that we have, the good that we have enjoyed and the evil that we have suffered. and there is no duty, there's no commandment in the Bible that is more frequently made and more insistently than the call to remember, the duty to remember. The Hebrew word is zahor. And that's his whole life was an act of remembrance for the victims of the Holocaust of the European Jewish people. You know me, I'm a big history buff, as I've said, and I'm distressed that there has been an almost purposeful campaign of historical amnesia in Canada. You can graduate from high school in 7 of our 10 provinces without ever having properly studied Canadian history or civics. You know, I think there's a course in grade 6, but there's no sustained like high school serious study of Canadian history. And then more recently, we've had this this trendy, woke, critical theory coming out of the universities and infecting media and now politics, government institutions, and which says that basically Canada is virtually an illegitimate settler state that is steeped in genocide itself and institutional racism, and that basically, you know, the Canada is an immoral enterprise. I find this stuff really offensive. And I think the way to address it is through a proper, factual, balanced understanding of our real history, which understands why is it that Canada is seen as a beacon around the world? Why do people all around the world want to come here? Imperfect though we may be, how have we built one of the greatest countries in human history in terms of freedom and opportunity? And if we're going to celebrate those achievements, the achievements of our history, we must also acknowledge the wrongdoings and the injustices in our history. So I take not a kind of Pollyannish view of Canadian history, which is that we should gloss over, deny, or minimize those injustices. We should acknowledge them, but not obsess over them. And I think that's the challenge for us, which is how do you acknowledge those wrongs, learn from them, and move on? And I must say, I found the approach of the Ukrainian Canadian community organizations very constructive in that regard. They weren't asking for a formal apology. They weren't asking for sort of sackcloth and ashes. They were asking for appropriate historical recognition and redress that would recover the memory of the internees of the injustice they suffered, and transmit that memory into the future through various projects, documentaries, memorials, statues, cultural projects, restoring a couple of the camps as a kind of testament and museum. It was a really, I think, mature model for how to deal with historical injustices.
And from that meeting 25 years ago to the announcement of the redress settlement, which was, I think, in May of 2008, there is now a fairly famous photo in the Ukrainian community of you with delegates from the Ukrainian community at that announcement. Do you have memories of that?
Yeah, I should say before we got to that while I've commended the community organizations for their really, I think, visionary approach to redress around First World War internment operations, they were also really tough negotiators, particularly my friend Paul Grod, at the time president of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. He had just been elected, but he was part of the negotiating team with Andy Holodchevsky of the Ukrainian Canadian Foundation for Shevchenko, then president as well of the UCHIBA, the Ukrainian Canadian Business Professional Association, and in the wings, but very much pushing hard, was Lyubomir Luchuk, the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Association, who had discovered the issue. And those guys were, let me tell you, they were like a dog with a bone. And I must be honest with you, Tyler, I did not have a mandate from Prime Minister Harper to deal with this. Even, most of the people in our government, you know PM Harper himself is a history buff. I'm not sure what his knowledge level was, but very few people in the government had heard about this, and I had no budget to negotiate redress. So I was between a rock and a hard place for about a year, 18 months, between those Ukrainian groups led primarily by Paul Grod and the I can think it's a long enough go. I had a senior minister at the time who was not interested in this at all. I was at Canadian Heritage as a junior minister. She didn't want to give me any money. She thought the whole thing was not worth our time. So I had and you've been in these fights in government where you're trying to persuade your colleagues to open the purse strings and let you solve a problem. And eventually we got that done. And it was a great...
Was it just the quantum? Were there any other sticking points?
Yeah, it was the whole thing. But any money, how much money, what it would go for, should the government manage it, should the community manage it. The community's position was that the Shevchenko Foundation should manage it because it was set up already with the infrastructure and an endowment to support Ukrainian cultural projects. I thought that made sense. As a conservative, I believe, empower civil society to do the job. That's what we landed on, and we signed the agreement on the grounds of the Canadian National Exhibition in Toronto, as you say, in May of 2008, in the facility where the internees in Toronto were rounded up when they were taken by the police, by the RCMP. Before they were sent to the internment camps, they camped out and were processed at this facility at the Canadian National Exhibition, and that's where we signed it. So it was a very touching moment.
Wow. You mentioned World War II internment of Japanese Canadians. You mentioned as well high-ranking officials within the government back in 2008 not being aware of the issue. There's a fairly famous now documentary of internment operations called It Never Happened. And I actually, just in 2023, when I was still a minister, had a conversation with a high-ranking person in Alberta, not somebody in government, but somebody who was high-ranking. And I remember talking to this person about my advocacy with the Ukrainian community for a statue on the legislative grounds. And I remember her asking me, why would the Ukrainian community want a statue about internment? Why would they care about Japanese Canadians? And I was shocked, and I told her about the issue, and she ended up saying to me, that never happened, the exact title of the documentary. So the fact that you had people in 2008 who didn't know about the issue was not shocking at all.
Which is why these projects were necessary, and there's a lot more educational work to be done. But the degree of ignorance about it is astonishing. And there's one aspect I need to introduce. Another one of the complexities in the negotiations, Tyler, was this. The government was approached by the Ukrainian Canadian community, by several organizations in it. And it's a very well organized community. One of the things I admire most about the Ukrainian Canadian community is how loyal multi-generational Canadian Ukrainian descendants are to their identity. I'm talking, fourth and fifth generation. I mean, former Premier Stelmach is, I think, third gen, and he didn't speak English until he went to grade school. That's how deliberate the community has always been about retaining its identity. There was, though, a nuance in the First World War internment operations, which is that it wasn't simply, and I sometimes have to remind my Ukrainian friends this, it was not an ethnic racism directed exclusively at Ukrainians. It affected foreign nationals who had come to Canada from Axis countries in the First World War, that is to say, from essentially Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so that included at least a dozen different ethnicities. Obviously, in fact, Ukraine didn't exist in 1914 as a formal modern republic. Ukraine existed as an idea, as an identity, historically grounded, but there were what we then called in Canada Bukovinians or Galicians from Western Ukraine. There were Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, Slovenians, Croatians, Serbians, Dalmatians, others, Austrians, and even some Germans who were interned. And so what I was trying to get to the Ukrainian community, I said, look, please, let's reach out to these other communities in Canada, make them aware of what happened, bring them into the solution, make sure that they're included in some of the funding, the projects, and the commemoration. So it's a broader Canadian experience, not an exclusively Ukrainian Canadian experience.
Correct. You talked about the innovative approach that the Ukrainian community had when they approached you to this issue. Are there other lessons that Canadians should take from the redress settlement from 2008? Are there any lessons that we're forgetting as Canadians?
Well, I think the core lesson is what we've been talking about, which is the need to know our history, the good and the bad. And you know, it strikes me as another aspect of this is we need to acknowledge that there were many proud ethnic Ukrainian Canadians who volunteered for, died for, bled for, fought for Canada, the Dominion, and the Crown on the front lines of the Great War, including some who won the Victoria Cross. So we had Ukrainian Canadians achieving the highest levels of valor in defense of a country that was actually interning some of their fellow nationals. And I find that really astonishing. It reminds me of, I talked earlier about the Chinese head tax. Well, there was also the Exclusion Act, and Chinese Canadians exclusively were barred from citizenship until 1947. And the guy who campaigned so hard to reverse that was a Chinese Canadian named Doug Zhang, who volunteered with a bunch of other Chinese for the Canadian Special Forces to operate behind Japanese enemy lines in the Asian theater, particularly in Manchuria. And it was through their bravery and their service to a country that would not give them citizenship that they won citizenship. He became the first non-Caucasian Canadian MP elected with Diefenbaker in '57, and I named the Government of Canada office building after Doug Zhang. So to say, like, this is a Canadian civil rights hero, and I think there are a lot of Ukrainian Canadian civil rights heroes of the Great War that we need better to acknowledge as well.
You mentioned the difficulty with the government lawyers in the potential liability that government might be open to. There were difficult negotiations about the $10 million settlement for that would go to the recognition fund. But now, as we look 20 years later, do you have any thoughts on the achievements of the fund over the last 20 years?
Yeah, there have been so many good projects. And again, this is part of the wisdom of the community to ask for an endowment. So it would generate revenue that could fund projects in perpetuity if well managed. And that's what's happening. I mean, look, any endowment fund has some ups and downs in terms of its investment and its value. But that was a much, much smarter approach than just getting us writing a check and the community spending it on a bunch of projects, because that would have disappeared 10, 15 years ago. And when I say disappeared, I mean those projects that would have been spent, there'd be some durable projects. But now it's something that a generation from now, 2 generations from now, young Canadians of Ukrainian origin who have no direct personal connection to those events will still be coming to community events to commemorate this. They'll see the memorials, they'll see the plaques, they'll see documentaries that have been produced, and they'll be challenged to do their own part as well. I think that's really cool. It's about transmitting the memory. That's what the endowment allows for.
We now also have with us some young folks from the Ukrainian Canadian community who are with us today, and I'm going to introduce a few of them, who each of them have a question for you.
Honourable Jason Kenney, thank you so much again for coming. As mentioned, my name is Anna Maria. I'm representing Ukrainian Youth Association Calgary branch, and we were wondering, you already talked a little bit about it, but our question is, what was the biggest challenge in getting support, both political and public, for the internment commemoration initiatives?
Well, the biggest challenge was ignorance. The biggest challenge is, I think many Canadians of Ukrainian origin didn't know anything or much about it until about 25 years ago. And non-Ukrainian Canadians knew even less. I mentioned in my interview with Tyler, all of these other ethnic groups who had come to Canada from primarily the Austro-Hungarian Empire's jurisdiction before 1914. Serbs and Hungarians and Austrians and Croats and so forth. And they knew even less. Like when we approached them, some of them said, yeah, we heard something from grandma about this, but generally there was vast ignorance. So that was one thing. And the other thing was just a resistance within government, both amongst officials and some political people, to acknowledge historical injustices of the past. There is a feeling that creates legal liabilities, and we should just let bygones be bygones. So those were the two challenges, the big ones to overcome.
Thank you.
Jason Kenney, thank you so much for joining with us today. Some questions I have for you today is, number one, why did you take it upon yourself to inform Canadians about how Ukrainians were treated at these internment camps? And do you feel that there is still more to be done at the internment camps?
On the first question, I as I've said, I have a very strong devotion to history, and Canadian history in particular. And I think that a proper devotion to a proper patriotism requires an acknowledgement about a country's flaws, to learn from them, to overcome them. And in some respects, the greatness of a country like Canada is just that, our ability to constantly seek to improve ourselves. So I thought that learning from this injustice was very important. In terms of, is there more to do? Sure, we could always do more, I'm sure. I'm sure that the Shevchenko Foundation would have been happy with a $100 million endowment as opposed to $10 million. But I think it's a good, the fund is able to generate several $100,000 a year in project funding in perpetuity. And if it's well managed, that could be in the future millions of dollars of annual funding. There's been a lot of really good durable projects. By the way, we're doing this in Alberta. I was in this church in June of 2013. Is that when the flood was, 13? When we were getting ready to go up to Banff to cut the ribbon on the Cave and Basin Interpretive Center, which is where one of the camps was. Because a lot of the tourist infrastructure in Banff was built by Ukrainian and other First World War internees between 1914 and 1920. And so we wanted to, in Banff National Park, we built this interpretive center, and it's excellent, on the site of a former internment camp. And we were going to go up there in June of 2013 to cut the ribbon, but there were the floods and we couldn't go up. And there were some people stuck up there that for a couple of days. It was a very awkward moment. But my point is, if you're in southern Alberta, or if you're visiting the Banff National Park, I'd like to suggest to viewers that they take a detour and go to the Cave and Basin. Just Google that. It's 5 minutes outside the town of Banff, town site.
Thank you very much, Jason Kenney. And the second question I have is, why were Ukrainian Canadians persecuted during World War I in the first place?
Well, because of distrust. It's hard for us to imagine how massive the Great War, the First World War, was for countries like Canada. We were a country of 8.5 million people, and yet we had nearly 900,000 Canadians in uniform. It's remarkable. 10% of the population was in uniform. So virtually every young man was in uniform at one point or another. And we suffered 65,000 battle deaths in the First World War. I think 200,000 people with serious wounds. Countless guys who came back shell-shocked with what we would now call PTSD, having gone through the horrors of the most horrific battlefields in history to that point. So you think about that country, all into this huge war, and so it wasn't hard in a way for paranoia and suspicion to start to circulate. There was a view that there was this fifth column in Canada of people who had not yet pledged allegiance to the king. They weren't yet Canadian subjects or British subjects, what we now call citizens. They were more recent arrivals typically. And their legal loyalty was to, for example, the Austro-Hungarian Emperor. They were subjects of the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the German Kaiser. And so they were considered enemy aliens in the legal term. And that created, there was a fear that they would be, sending secrets back to our enemies in Europe. They would be undermining the Canadian war effort. Now, in retrospect, I mean, there is virtually zero evidence of that. I think there may have been a handful of cases of people who were charged with actual treason, primarily from the German community, but broadly speaking, I'm not aware of any evidence of any Ukrainian Canadians who did anything disloyal, anything that would constitute treason. It was a kind of social panic that took over.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kenney, for coming today here. My name is Costa. I'm representing Plast, Calgary, and our question for you is, what were some of the hurdles that you encountered throughout this project, and how did you overcome them?
Well, a big hurdle I had was initially no support from within the government, no money, and huge expectations on the Ukrainian side. So it was a really awkward spot to be handling those negotiations. But I'm a fairly stubborn guy. I'm Irish origin, and one of our character traits is stubbornness. So I wouldn't let it go. And I don't remember all the details, but I'm pretty sure I just went around my senior minister, just went to the prime minister and explained what was what, and he backed me up. So, when that happens, you can get a lot done.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you,
Thanks,
Costa.
Costa.
All right, thank you, Mr. Kenney, for being here today. Our question from the Ukrainian Dancer is, since the end of the formal agreement in 2023, what is your hope for how the Shevchenko Foundation and the Ukrainian community will continue this legacy of education and remembrance?
Well, I think it's important that the foundation ensure it has good, sound governance in the future. As an endowment, that's very important. Not sure if all of the youth reps here are familiar. An endowment is a special kind of fund which has a specific purpose, and generally usually it's a nonprofit or a charity, and generally the idea is donors put money into it. It has an independent board that ensures professional investment of that money that is relatively low risk. You don't want to play the stock market too aggressively. You tend to have a fairly low risk investment strategy. But the idea is you want to generate enough investment income every year so that it's more than inflation. And then you ideally have what's called real growth in the fund every year, which is to say you keep, let's say inflation is 3%. Hopefully you're going to get returns of 5, 6, 7, 8%. And then so you would keep like a little bit so that the fund grows every year faster than inflation. And then you take the surplus, whatever is left over in terms of investment income, and put it towards programming. Now, the challenge can be, that means, because endowment funds and investment markets are not flat and predictable, they bounce around. So it means that from year to year, the budget they have that they can put into community projects on internment is going to fluctuate. And that can be frustrating, but they just need good, sound governance to make sure that the fund continues to grow and is there 20, 50, 100 years from now. That's why we did the endowment, and I have confidence the community will give it that sound governance.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Kenney.
Later on, after you were Secretary of State for Multiculturalism, you became Minister of Defense. And
Is this a question?
no, it's not. Just while we were waiting for Sophia to get mic'd up, I just want to say to everybody here, your Operation Unifier and the consequences of your support of Ukraine as a consequence of that. In November of 2019, you and I went to a dinner, and Poroshenko had come to Edmonton.
President
to visit.
Poroshenko, yeah.
And during his speech, he credited you for being the godfather of the modern Ukrainian army. I just wanted to say that to everyone.
I think that was far, far too generous on his part, but we did play a big role in modernizing the Ukrainian military. Canada was the first NATO country with a training operation and a large and sustained one. We've had over 6,000 Canadian troops participate in that since I launched it in 2014. But more than that, we also gave a lot of equipment. One of the key things he's talked to me about, Mr. Poroshenko, is we gave Ukraine some very highly classified, high-resolution, real-time satellite imagery that helped them to see the separatist troop movements in Donbass, and that prevented losing a lot more territory, he tells me. So it's gratifying to know Canada played that role. and hopefully will continue to.
So my name is Sophia. I'm representing the Jersey Ukrainian Dance Society. So we know that you have a long history of support for Ukraine, for Ukrainian culture, and the Ukrainian community in Alberta and across Canada. What motivated or inspired you to establish the Canadian First World War Internment Fund?
Well, as I said before, I felt a compulsion to acknowledge this injustice as somebody who takes history very seriously. But I'll be honest, the pressure, I was a politician too. I mean, and the political pressure from the community was pretty intense. I remember, I think a week after becoming Minister for Multiculturalism for Canada, Paul Grod was all over me. He was the president, the newly elected president of Ukrainian Canadian Congress at the time. And he arranged to have lunch with me. I wasn't even minister for a week. And he gave me, I think, a 4-page letter of itemized demands from the community. I said, like, Paul, you know, cut this down to, give me 3 or 4 points. Let's start make baby steps first. I said, what really matters? What's at the top of your list? And he said 2 things. Recognition of the genocidal nature of the Holodomor famine, which is another historical thing that was long denied and is still denied. And the second was a redress agreement for the First World War internment operations. So I said, I appreciate knowing what your most important goals are, and he was very effective, he and the others in the community, at pushing that forward. Going back to that meeting I had with Boris and constituents 25 years ago. So, moral of that story for the community, and this I think really matters on supporting Ukraine in the war, is be assertive. This is a big community, it's well organized. Be assertive, let elected people know that you expect them to support Ukraine. Be a squeaky wheel. All of the young people should be asking to see their MPs, even their MLAs, and I mean, that kind of pressure helped me to get the internment redress done, and I think it can help the Ukrainian community to maximize Canadian support for Ukraine.
Mr. Premier, you were exposed first to the history of Canada's first national internment operations in the 1990s.
The signing of the agreement with the Ukrainian Canadian community happened in 2008.
So are there any lessons from your experience that might enlighten the way forward for those of us involved in Ukrainian community life today and in the future?
Yeah, I'll just exactly pick up where I left off, which is to say first, the internment of quote-unquote enemy aliens in the First World War by Canada, including several thousand ethnic Ukrainian Canadians, was forgotten about from 1920 until about 2000. And it took some very courageous, stubborn Ukrainian Canadians to recover the memory, do the historical research, start to advocate for acknowledgement and redress, and eventually they got it. And I think that's a very important model for the Ukrainian community, which is changing now because of all the refugees who have come and other newcomers from Ukraine, some of whom will stay long term. I hope, by the way, I hope there will be peace and some people will choose to go and rebuild Ukraine. But regardless, the influx of newcomers means that the size and the vitality of the community is increasing. And so I encourage Ukrainian Canadians, whether they're 5th generation or they arrived 6 months ago, to be very strong advocates for Ukraine, for the community, but especially for support against Putin's invasion. And I know the community is doing that, but you can always do more. And it is not complicated. You know, it's no more complicated than Googling the name of your member of parliament, sending an email to his office, asking for a meeting, bringing some friends in, especially powerful voices of people who have been displaced by the war. Go in and speak to your MPs and say you expect Canada to freeze Russian assets, to give those assets to Ukraine, to increase shipments of armaments, to push back against Trump's isolation and abandonment of Ukraine. So I just encourage everyone in the community to use their voice. Redress of internment was a relatively small but very successful example of the community being politically organized. Now we have a much bigger task.
Thank you. And another question, if you could share one concrete piece of advice with us for the journey ahead for the Ukrainian community, what would that be?
To be faithful to your roots. When people come to a new country, they want to integrate. Many want to assimilate. Very often, immigrant families would not teach their children their mother tongue because they thought it would slow down their learning English or perfecting English or French. Ukrainian community was always an outlier in Canadian history. I cannot think of an ethnic or cultural community that has been more intentional about maintaining and transmitting its identity and language. And I'm talking about the whole period of Ukrainian presence in Canada from roughly 1900 till now. You have, as I mentioned earlier, a former Premier of Alberta, one of my predecessors, third generation, spoke Ukrainian at home, didn't speak English till he went to school. All of those beautiful Ukrainian churches like this one that dot the Canadian prairies, all of the Ukrainian community organizations and community halls, the youth groups which were started 90 and 100 years ago here. Why? Why are these things still going? Why are they still vital? I think it's because, in part, Ukrainians could not live their Ukrainian identity in Soviet Ukraine. And so they were more determined to live it and be loyal to it in the diaspora. So I think Putin's invasion is the strongest encouragement the community here in the diaspora could possibly have to go to Saturday school, to learn Ukrainian, third, fourth, fifth generation, to be involved in the dance groups, the cultural groups, to contribute to the community organizations, to be involved in the churches. This is one way the diaspora can respond to the yet another campaign by Moscow to deny the existence of the Ukrainian nation.
So after listening to the questions and your answers, your opinions and ideas, it is clear that we are recognized. The internment is recognized. There are challenges with it, and we are working towards the change. However, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but the topic of internment is in school curriculum. However, as I understand it, it is as an option for teachers who are interested in the topic or those who know about it, but it is not a mandatory topic. And I believe if we are working towards the change, it is something that should be included in the curriculum as a mandatory topic. How can we address it? How can we approach this? What can we do to make the change?
I think the broader problem is until recently there's been basically, for years, for 20, 30 years, virtually no requirement for Canadian history broadly. So you can't really mandate teaching one specific aspect of Canadian history if we don't have a Canadian history course in high school that's mandatory. So I think we really need to bolster social studies, history particularly, and then there will be the space in the curriculum to ensure a unit on the internment operation. And I'm going to say something that perhaps isn't, that might be a bit controversial, which is this. I don't want Canadian history taught as simply a bunch of isolated examples of historical injustices where young people end up graduating thinking this country is just a nightmare. And there are some that want to do that to Canada. They're very focused in doing so, for example, with the terrible experience of the Indigenous residential schools, in which many terrible things happened. I'm not minimizing that, but if all that we teach about Canadian history is internment or residential schools or the Chinese head tax, and we lose the broader story of building this amazing country, then I think we're doing students a disservice. So I say, yes, it should be part of it, but integrated into a more holistic and broadly positive story about building Canada.
Hello, Mr. Kenney. Thank you for your time. My name is Alexander Zagierski. I'm the president of Echoes of Ukraine Association. It's a media organization in the Ukrainian community. We do lots of work in the Ukrainian community here in Calgary and all over Alberta, Canada. Why, in your opinion, is it important to document things like the topic of internment or different important topics that are happening or have occurred?
Well, partly because if we don't learn from the lessons of history, we are bound to repeat them. And this is a very important lesson in our history. It's conceivable that we will have the temptation to treat an entire community as disloyal or suspect. And we need to learn from this history. So I think that's the most important thing, to learn from the lessons, good and bad.
Back when I was in high school, I learned there's a little part of the internment, I believe, in the social studies textbook, but that's about it. Maybe a few sentences. And how could we young people do something to improve the situation and perhaps to increase the amount of information in textbooks?
I think, I'll be honest with you, I'm somebody who's also was very involved in Holocaust education and commemoration efforts. I got Canada to join the International Task Force on Holocaust Education, Commemoration and Research. And I will have to tell you the truth. I think I have learned more about the Holocaust from movies and documentaries and cultural productions, stage plays and fiction than I ever could expect to in school. And so I say this because I think the most, young people, their attention is distracted with the iPhone generation. And I think the most powerful way to tell the story about Ukrainian internment is through cultural creativity, through TV and film productions, documentaries, works of fiction, cultural things that grab the imagination of young people. So I would encourage creative young Ukrainian Canadians to think about that. And I know the Shevchenko Foundation would be happy to fund projects like that.
Thank you.
That's what it's there for. Cheers.